What if the Greek gods awakened in the warp, Mount Olympus included? The first thing you need to understand is that lightning in the warp doesn't behave like lightning in real space. It doesn't arc from cloud to ground following neat physical laws. In the Immaterium, lightning is thought made manifest, will give in terrible form. And when Zeus's first bolt tore through the membrane of unreality, it didn't just strike a target. It remembered what it meant to strike. What it had been to deliver divine judgment when humanity still wore bronze and offered hecatombs at marble altars. The demons caught in that initial cascade didn't die. They were unmade, their essence scattered across dimensions that had no name, reduced to less than the screaming nothing from which the warp itself had first coalesced. And in the eternal now of the Immaterium, where past and future collapse into a singular moment of infinite possibility, Mount Olympus simply was, as if it had always been there, a marble impossibility thrust like a blade into the heart of madness itself. I was there when the astropaths started screaming. Not the usual screaming, we were all accustomed to that. The occasional psychic discharge that came with maintaining communion across the void. This was different. This was every soul-bound servant of the Emperor within 3 sectors, suddenly experiencing the same vision, the same impossible transmission that their minds refused to process, even as it burned itself into their synaptic pathways. They spoke in languages that hadn't been uttered since old Earth's classical age, tongues that the administratum's most learned etymologists had to reconstruct from fragmentary records buried in the deepest archives of Terra. The words meant nothing to most of us initially, just glossolalia babbling. But the Ordo Malleus understood immediately. The Grey Knights dispatched to investigate came back changed, their usual stoic demeanor cracked by something that looked disturbingly like religious awe. They spoke in hushed tones about a mountain that shouldn't exist, crowned with structures of white stone that radiated an order so absolute it made the Immaterium seem like a half-remembered dream. The warp has always been a realm of symbolism and psychic resonance, a place where humanity's collective unconscious bleeds into reality and takes on forms both terrible and transcendent. The chaos gods themselves are nothing more and nothing less than the coalesced emotions and beliefs of sentient beings given terrible autonomy and purpose. So when the question arose of how Mount Olympus could manifest within the Immaterium, the answer was both simple and profoundly disturbing. Because enough minds had once believed in it. Not the sanitized myths we teach in Scholaria, stripped of power and rendered into moral fables for children. The real belief, the kind that had once moved civilizations, that had prompted kings to alter the course of wars based on the interpretation of bird flights, that had seen entire cities depopulated as their populations marched to distant shores because an oracle had spoken. That kind of faith doesn't simply evaporate when new religions supplant it. It sinks deep into the psychic bedrock of a species, dormant but never truly dead, waiting for the right conditions to resurge. The warp is not bound by linear time. This is not a metaphor or poetic exaggeration. It is a fundamental truth that makes any attempt to understand events within the Immaterium an exercise in controlled madness. So when we say Olympus appeared, we are using inadequate terminology to describe a phenomenon that our mortal minds can barely conceptualize. In one moment that was also every moment and no moment at all. The mountain simply existed where it had not existed before, thrusting up from the roiling chaos stuff like a fist through water, carrying with it not just physical form but an entire cosmology, a complete metaphysical architecture that predated the Emperor's Imperium by millennia. The marble slopes remained somehow pristine despite the corruption that surrounded them, the white stone shining with an impossible radiance that hurt to perceive even through filtered Vox recordings and second-hand accounts. At its peak, the palaces of the gods stood precisely as they had been described in ancient texts, but grander, more terrible, because they were no longer filtered through the limitations of mortal artistry or the corruption of centuries of retelling. This was the archetypal Olympus, the Platonic ideal made manifest, and its mere presence was an affront to the Ruinous Powers. The Chaos God's initial response was predictable in its ferocity and utterly inadequate in its execution. Legions of demons, bloodletters of Khorne, demonettes of Slaanesh, plague-bearers of Nergal, and the ever-shifting horrors of Sench surged toward the mountain in waves that would have drowned entire hive worlds. They crashed against Olympus like tides against a breakwater, and they shattered just as thoroughly. The first we learned of this was through the reports of Navigator House Belisarius, whose representatives described a stable eddy forming within the warp, a region where the usual metaphorical nature of Immaterium navigation suddenly became distressingly literal. Ships attempting to pass near this phenomenon found their Geller fields straining against something that wasn't quite warp stuff in the traditional sense, something that imposed geometry and reason onto a realm that had never known either. 3 vessels were lost in the initial encounters, translated out of real space and into the Immaterium proper by what their astropaths described as a gravitational pull that operated on psychic rather than physical mass. Their last transmission spoke of a mountain, impossibly tall, around which storms of unnatural lightning played. Then silence. Zeus himself stood at Olympus's peak, or so the scattered reports claimed. Inquisitor Covenant of the Ordo Malleus managed to capture a psychic impression from one of the few astropaths who survived proximity to the phenomenon, and what he extracted was fragmentary but deeply disturbing. The king of gods was not as classical scholars had depicted him. No benevolent patriarch dispensing wisdom from a throne. This was Zeus as he had been conceived in the minds of those who had truly feared him. A being of such raw power that his mere attention could obliterate a soul. His lightning was not an aesthetic flourish or symbolic representation. When he struck at the fundamental essence of his targets, erasing them from the warp itself in a way that suggested an understanding of the Immaterium's nature that predated even the age of technology's psychic sciences. The demons learned quickly that Mount Olympus was not territory to be claimed through conventional assault. This was war on a conceptual level, and the Greek gods were fighting with weapons forged from the very same psychic substance that had given the chaos gods their power. Athena's strategic genius translated into something far more terrifying within the warp. She didn't plan battles in the traditional sense. She understood them, perceived them as complete totalities from inception to conclusion, and then acted with a precision that made every movement, every decision, an inevitable step toward victory. Demon princes who had orchestrated the downfall of entire sectors found themselves outmaneuvered by tactics they couldn't comprehend, trapped in strategic paradoxes where every choice led inexorably to their dissolution. She fought with spear and aegis, but these were no mere weapons. The spear pierced the boundaries between thought and reality, and whatever it struck found itself subjected to pure reason, to absolute logic that was anathema to the chaos nature of warp entities. Her shield bore not the emperor's Aquila, but the head of Medusa, and those who looked upon it found their formless essence crystallizing, solidifying into stone that then crumbled under the weight of its own impossibility. The few imperial observers who witnessed these conflicts through psychic scrying reported that Athena fought with a cold certainty that was almost mechanical in its perfection, yet undeniably divine in its execution. She was what war would be, if war could be distilled into its purest, most lethal form, stripped of all chaos and rendered into an art of such refined brutality that even the war master himself might have paused in respect. Ares reveled in the carnage with a joy that made Khorne's bloodthirsters seem almost restrained by comparison. Where the blood god's demons killed because they were driven by an endless hunger for violence, Ares killed because he loved it. Because each severed limb and shattered skull was an expression of an aesthetic principle that humanity had spent 10,000 years trying to evolve beyond. He fought at the mountain's base, where the demon legions crashed against Olympus in waves of teeth and claws and impossible geometries. And he met them with a laughter that echoed across the Immaterium like thunder. His blade, not a chainsword or power weapon, but a simple bronze xiphos that nevertheless cut through warp stuff as if it were mortal flesh, rose and fell with a rhythm that suggested music, a terrible symphony conducted in arterial spray and the death screams of entities that had never known mortality. The Inquisition's analysts spent months trying to understand the implications of what they were witnessing. Ares was not chaos, yet he embodied destruction as thoroughly as any demon prince. He was not aligned with the Emperor, yet he fought against the Ruinous Powers with a ferocity that exceeded even the most zealous of the Imperium's warriors. He existed in a category that imperial doctrine had no framework to process, and that terrified the ecclesiarchy more than they were willing to admit. Apollo's arrows were perhaps the most insidious weapons deployed in this impossible conflict. He stood upon Olympus's heights, his bow drawn, and when he released each shaft, it flew not through space, but through meaning itself. Demons struck by Apollo's arrows didn't simply die. They were infected with truth, with clarity, with an absolute understanding of their own nature that no warp entity was meant to possess. They became aware, truly aware, of what they were. Fragments of mortal emotion given false autonomy. Pretenders to divinity who were nothing more than parasites, feeding on the psychic waste of thinking beings. This awareness was poison to their existence. Demons who had terrorized real space for millennia suddenly found themselves questioning their own reality. And in the warp where belief shapes existence, that questioning was fatal. They unraveled from within, their essence dispersing back into the raw chaos stuff from which they had been formed. And the screaming of their dissolution carried across the Immaterium like a plague. Tzeentch himself attempted to counter this threat, sending his most powerful lords of change to weave illusions and deceptions thick enough to protect his servants from Apollo's terrible illumination. But the sun god's light burned through every false reality, every comforting lie, until nothing remained but the unbearable truth of existence in the warp. Artemis hunted in the spaces between. The liminal zones where the warp's nature became uncertain even by Immaterium standards. She moved through dimensions that mortal minds couldn't perceive, tracking prey that thought itself beyond the reach of any predator. Her targets were the greater demons, the demon princes, the entities who had grown fat and powerful on millennia of worship and sacrifice. She killed them not with overwhelming force, but with the patience of a hunter who understands her quarry better than it understands itself. Each death was precisely calculated, timed to create maximum disruption among the demonic hierarchies. When she felled a great unclean one, she did so in the middle of one of Nurgle's great councils, the diseased giant toppling forward to crush a dozen heralds beneath its collapsing bulk. When she ended a keeper of secrets, she waited until the creature was in the midst of corrupting an imperial world, so that its sudden dissolution would sever the psychic connections binding thousands of cultists, leaving them confused and vulnerable to the Inquisition's purges. Artemis understood war as ecology, as a system of predators and prey that could be manipulated through the careful removal of keystone species. And she prosecuted her campaign with a ruthlessness that made the Officio Assassinorum seem merciful by comparison. Poseidon's domain should have been meaningless in the warp, where physical oceans were at best metaphorical constructs. Yet he made the Immaterium itself behave like the seas he had once ruled. Vast currents began to flow through regions of the warp that had previously been characterized by chaotic turbulence, organized streams of psychic energy that pulled ships off course and deposited them light years from their intended destinations. The navigators' reports grew increasingly frantic as they discovered that traditional routes through the warp were being altered, restructured according to patterns they didn't recognize. Some ships emerged from the Immaterium ahead of schedule, their journey impossibly shortened by riding currents that flowed in directions that had no correlation to real space geometry. Others were delayed for weeks, trapped in psychic doldrums where the warp's usual roiling energy simply ceased to move. And the worst cases were those vessels that encountered what the surviving crew members described as storms. Not the psychic tempests that navigators had learned to avoid over 10 millennia of Imperium travel, but genuine meteorological events that had no right to exist in a realm without atmosphere or weather. Ships were battered by waves of pure thought, dragged down into abyssal depths that existed only in metaphor until Poseidon decided otherwise. And those few that survived to translate back into real space carried crews who spoke in terrified whispers about a god whose anger made the warp itself obey physical laws. Hades emerged from depths that made even the warp's darkest reaches seem shallow by comparison. The dead have always been theoretically accessible to chaos sorcerers through necromancy and soul-binding. But these practices worked within certain understood limitations. Hades didn't acknowledge those limitations. He walked through the afterlife as if it were his personal domain. And he began doing something that should have been impossible, even by the standards of the Immaterium. He started recalling the dead, not as mindless servitors or tortured wraiths, but as fully realized shades who retained their memories and personalities. Imperial psychers who died in service to the emperor found themselves pulled from whatever rest or torment awaited them and reconstituted on Olympus, given form by Hades' will, and set to tasks that served the Greek gods' purposes. The theological implications were devastating. The ecclesiarchy had spent 10,000 years teaching that the faithful who died in service to the emperor would find peace at his side. But here was evidence that death was not the end of service. The consciousness persisted beyond mortality in ways that could be manipulated by powers that predated imperial doctrine. Worse, Hades showed no particular reverence for the emperor. He took souls as he pleased, apparently operating under the principle that all who died fell within his rightful jurisdiction, and there was nothing the Imperium could do to stop him. Hephaestus had found his forge, and it burned with a fire that hurt to perceive even through psychic divination. In the depths beneath Olympus, the smith god worked metal that wasn't metal, shaping raw warp stuff into forms that should have been impossible to maintain within the Immaterium's constantly shifting nature. He created weapons for his fellow gods, but not just weapons. He crafted chains that could bind demons to specific concepts, forcing them to embody ideas that were antithetical to their nature until they tore themselves apart trying to reconcile the contradiction. He forged armor that imposed geometry onto whoever wore it, making them fixed points of stability within the warp's chaos. Most disturbing of all, he began crafting something that the Ordo Malleus's seers could only describe as automata, independent constructs that moved and fought with purpose, but lacked true sentience, operating according to principles that predated even the dark age of technology's understanding of artificial intelligence. These creations marched forth from Olympus in formations that were mathematically perfect, attacking demon strongholds with a coordination that suggested hive mind organization, but without the psychic signature that such a connection would create. They were an army that shouldn't exist, constructed from materials that couldn't exist, following orders given by a god who had supposedly been myth for longer than the Immaterium had endured. Aphrodite's role in this conflict was the most subtle, and therefore the most dangerous. She didn't fight on the battlefield, didn't rain down divine wrath upon demon hordes. Instead, she moved through the warp like a virus, spreading a contamination that the Ruinous Powers couldn't defend against because it targeted something fundamental to their nature. She whispered to the demons, and her whispers were of love. Not the obsessive possession that Slanesh understood, but genuine affection, the desire for connection rather than consumption. Demons who heard her voice found themselves experiencing emotions they weren't designed to process, developing attachments to specific mortals or fellow warp entities that created complications in their service to chaos. A bloodletter who had spent eternities killing indiscriminately might suddenly find itself hesitating before striking a particular victim, confused by feelings it had no framework to understand. A plague-bearer might begin tending to its diseases with something approaching care rather than merely spreading corruption. These small changes propagated through the demonic hierarchies like cracks spreading through glass, creating vulnerabilities that the other Olympian gods exploited with ruthless efficiency. The chaos gods, Tibit, attempted to purge the affected demons, but Aphrodite's influence proved remarkably persistent. And each purge only demonstrated to the surviving entities that their masters considered them expendable, a realization that itself created further doubt and instability. Hermes had become the warp's most dangerous spy, moving between realms with a freedom that defied every protective ward and psychic barrier that the Immaterium and the Ruinous Powers could erect. He carried messages between Olympus and destinations across the galaxy, and no force seemed capable of intercepting him. Inquisitors who attempted to track his movements through augury and divination found their scrying simply sliding off him as if he existed in a perpetual blind spot of fate itself. He appeared in the throne rooms of demon princes to deliver challenges from Zeus, materialized aboard black ships to converse with psychers before vanishing again before the Sisters of Silence could respond, and was even reported within the imperial palace itself, though these accounts were so heavily redacted that only those with the highest clearance could access them. What made Hermes particularly troubling was his apparent amorality. He served the Olympian gods faithfully, but he showed no hostility toward the Immaterium and no particular reverence for the emperor. He was a messenger, nothing more or less, and he would deliver his messages regardless of what barriers stood in his way. The Officio Assassinorum attempted to target him 3 times, deploying Colexis assassins whose anti-psychic abilities should have been able to affect even powerful warp entities. All 3 assassins simply disappeared, their fates unknown, and Hermes continued his work unhindered. Dionysus brought madness, but not the random insanity that chaos spread through possession and corruption. His madness had structure, had purpose, had a strange kind of ecstatic joy that made it almost appealing to those it affected. Imperial worlds near the warp's rifts began reporting strange phenomena. Entire populations seized by simultaneous visions of impossible beauty, dancing through streets in choreographed patterns they couldn't have known, speaking prophecies in languages that mixed classical Greek with imperial Gothic and tongues that had never been uttered by human vocal cords. The Ordo Hereticus responded as they always did to signs of mass possession, deploying exterminatus protocols against the most severely affected worlds. But the madness spread nonetheless. It moved through the warp's currents like the psychic equivalent of a viral infection, touching astropaths and psychers first, but eventually reaching even untrained minds in sufficient proximity to the Immaterium's leakage. Those affected described experiencing a form of clarity, a understanding that mortal consciousness was itself a form of imposed limitation, and that by embracing the divine madness, they could perceive truths that would otherwise remain forever hidden. The Inquisition classified this as a new form of chaos corruption. But there were troubling differences. Those touched by Dionysian madness showed no signs of physical mutation, displayed no hostility toward the emperor, and when questioned under psychic interrogation, revealed minds that remained fundamentally human despite their altered state. They had not been corrupted into something else. They had been expanded. Their consciousness stretched to encompass experiences that baseline humanity wasn't meant to process. And the distinction between this and true chaos taint proved extremely difficult to define in practical terms. Demeter's influence manifested in ways that the Adeptus Administratum found deeply concerning, because she began affecting the agricultural worlds that fed the Imperium's vast population. Crops that should have failed instead flourished, yields increasing beyond anything the agri-combines could project. At first, this seemed like an unqualified benefit. But the Magos biologists who investigated these anomalies discovered disturbing alterations in the plant genetics. The crops were developing resistances to diseases and pests that didn't exist yet, as if anticipating evolutionary pressures that wouldn't emerge for generations. More troubling, they were becoming psychically active. Not in any dramatic sense that would trigger immediate alarms, but in subtle ways that created low-level resonances between the plants and the populations that consumed them. Entire hive worlds began experiencing synchronized dreams, billions of people sharing visions of fields of golden wheat under bronze skies, of harvest festivals that celebrated gods whose names they didn't recognize. The ecclesiarchy tried to counter this with increased devotional services, but the dreams persisted, growing more vivid with each season's harvest. Some among the Ordo Malleus argued that this was a form of mass conditioning, a preparation for a later corruption. But they couldn't identify what that corruption might be. The populations remained loyal to the emperor, continued to tithe and serve, showed no signs of heresy. They simply dreamed of Demeter. And through those dreams, she was slowly writing herself into the Imperium's collective unconscious. Hera's wrath was a focused and terrible thing, and she directed it not at the Imperium, but at the chaos gods themselves, in ways that suggested personal vendetta rather than strategic necessity. She targeted Slanesh particularly, perhaps recognizing in the Prince of Pleasure a twisted mirror of her own domain over marriage and sacred bonds, where Slanesh corrupted relationships into obsession and possession. Hera embodied the ideal of partnership, of two beings choosing to unite their fates despite all obstacles. She moved through the warp, identifying the most powerful of Slaanesh's servants and systematically destroying them. And her methods were unusually cruel, even by the standards of divine conflict. She would bind demon princesses in marriages to concepts that revolted them, chains of obligation that forced them to embody fidelity when their nature demanded excess, to choose single devotions when their essence sought infinite experience. The demons didn't die immediately. They suffered, trapped in conceptual cages that prevented them from expressing their fundamental nature, and their agony echoed through the warp as a warning to others. Slanesh responded with fury, sending greater forces against Olympus. But Hera met each assault personally, her peacock-feathered cloak spreading behind her like a constellation of watching eyes that saw through every deception. The other Olympian gods generally avoided interfering in her vendetta. Even Zeus knew better than to step between his queen and those who had earned her enmity. The Imperium's response to Mount Olympus's manifestation was characteristically divided and inefficient. The High Lords of Terra held 17 sessions debating whether the Greek gods represented a new chaos faction, a xenoform threat, or a phenomenon that required an entirely new classification. The ecclesiarchy demanded that they be declared heretical entities and targeted for destruction, arguing that any power that claimed divinity beyond the emperor constituted blasphemy of the highest order. The Ordo Malleus took a more cautious position, pointing out that the Olympian gods were currently fighting against the Ruinous Powers with effectiveness that exceeded even the Grey Knight's capabilities, and that opening a two-front war would be strategically catastrophic. The Adeptus Mechanicus, characteristically, approached the situation as a research opportunity, dispatching exploratory fleets toward the region of the Warp, where Olympus had manifested with the goal of capturing data on how these entities manipulated reality. 3 of those fleets disappeared entirely. One returned with its entire crew dead, but their data cores intact, filled with sensor readings that suggested the Olympian gods operated on principles that predated even the standard template constructs. The Fabricator General ordered the data sealed and classified at the highest level, but copies had already spread through the Mechanicus's networks, and tech priests across the galaxy began developing dangerous new theories about the relationship between belief and reality. The Emperor's silence on the matter was deafening. Every faction within the Imperium waited for some sign, some indication of how the Master of Mankind viewed this development. But none came. The Custodian Guard refused all inquiries, maintaining their eternal vigil over the Golden Throne with no apparent concern for events in the Warp. Some took this as evidence that the Emperor did not consider the Olympian gods a threat. Others argued that his attention was too focused on maintaining the Astronomicon to spare energy for anything else. A few radical thinkers in the Inquisition privately speculated that perhaps the Emperor had known this would happen, that his grand design accounted for the possibility of humanity's ancestral gods awakening. But such theories were dangerous to voice aloud. What could not be denied was that the Imperium found itself in an unprecedented situation. For 10,000 years, the cosmic order had been relatively clear. Humanity served the Emperor, protected by his will against the depredations of chaos, Xenos, and heretics. Now there were gods who predated the Emperor's ascension, who wielded powers that operated outside the framework of imperial psychic science, and who apparently had their own agenda that only partially aligned with humanity's survival. The Eldar responded to Olympus's manifestation with what might charitably be called cautious interest, and more accurately described as barely concealed terror. Their far-sires had perceived the Greek gods awakening before it happened. They had walked the skein of fate and seen the branching possibilities that would lead to Mount Olympus tearing itself into the Warp. But they had dismissed it as impossible, a phantom future that could never actually manifest. When it did, it fundamentally challenged their understanding of how psychic entities formed and evolved. The Eldar had created a chaos god through their own excess, had birthed Slanesh from the collective depravity of their civilization. So they understood better than most how belief could coalesce into power. But the Greek gods were different. They were old, predating the fall by millennia of human history, and they had somehow survived the long ages when humanity had abandoned faith in them, when their names became nothing more than stories told to children. That they could return, could manifest with such terrible power after so long dormant, suggested that psychic entities might be far more persistent and resilient than the Eldar had believed. If the Greek gods could awaken, what other deities might be sleeping in the deep currents of the Warp, waiting for the right confluence of belief and circumstance to return? The question terrified the Eldari leadership, because they knew exactly what gods they had worshipped before Slanesh, and the prospect of those ancient powers returning was a nightmare beyond even she who thirsts. The Orcs, predictably, thought the whole situation was fantastic. War bosses across the galaxy began hearing about new gits to fight into warp. An entire was redirected toward the region where Olympus had manifested, eager to test themselves against gods who supposedly wielded lightning and earthquakes. The first orc incursions into Olympian territory ended exactly as one might expect, with vast numbers of greenskins charging up the mountain slopes, while Zeus systematically obliterated them with precisely targeted lightning strikes. The orcs loved it. Here were enemies who fought with proper enthusiasm, who understood that the best way to resolve a conflict was through direct application of overwhelming force. And the fact that they were losing badly only made the surviving orcs more determined to return with bigger mobs and more daca. The Olympian gods found themselves dealing with an enemy that couldn't be discouraged through military defeat, because the orcs measured success not in victory or survival, but in the quality of the fight itself. This created a strange dynamic where the greenskin invasions actually served as a defensive buffer. Demon forces attempting to assault Olympus found their approach complicated by vast orc armies who attacked everything indiscriminately, creating a chaotic war zone around the mountain that made organized assault nearly impossible. Some among the Grey Knights speculated that Zeus was deliberately allowing some orcs to survive and escape specifically to spread word of the good fightin' on the mountain, turning the greenskin tendency toward violence into an inadvertent defensive mechanism. The Necrons' reaction was more difficult to characterize, largely because the Necrons as a unified faction didn't exist. Each dynasty operated according to its own protocols and agenda. However, those overlords who became aware of Olympus's manifestation generally responded with what their ancient Xenos logic categorized as anomalous psychic phenomenon requiring investigation. Several Necron fleets departed their tomb worlds and navigated to the border regions of the warp storm where Olympus had appeared, deploying arcane sensor arrays that analyzed the psychic emanations with a precision that made the Mechanicus's best instruments look like primitive abaci. What they discovered troubled even their undying mechanical certainty. The Greek gods registered as legitimate reality rather than as warp-spawned phantasms, their existence verified by instruments that should have dismissed any psychic construct as meaningless electromagnetic interference. This suggested that belief could literally create reality, that consciousness could impose existence onto entities that hadn't previously been, and that called into question the fundamental materialist philosophy that had guided Necrontyr science before their transformation into the Deathless Legions. Some overlords began researching whether it might be possible to reverse engineer the process, to use psychic resonance to resurrect the Necrontyr gods who had been fed to the Citan during the war in heaven. The prospect of divine powers that could actually challenge the star gods, rather than simply serving as their food source, was tantalizing. But the technical challenges proved immense. Gods, it seemed, required believers in a way that the Necrons' deathless nature made difficult to provide. The Tau encountered Olympus through their usual method of gradual expansion and careful reconnaissance, and their response demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of their philosophy. Water-caste diplomats attempted to establish communication with the Olympian gods through traditional channels, broadcasting messages that spoke of mutual benefit and the greater good. The gods' response was to ignore them completely. This baffled the Tau leadership. Every other faction they had encountered responded to diplomatic overtures in some fashion, even if only to reject them violently. The silence from Olympus suggested a complete disinterest in the Tau's existence, as if humanity's youngest interstellar civilization simply didn't register as significant to beings whose perspective spanned millennia. The Earth caste attempted to study the phenomenon from a scientific perspective, deploying drones and sensor arrays to gather data. But their equipment malfunctioned in ways that defied troubleshooting when brought near the warp regions where Olympus manifested. The fire caste considered military options, but quickly discarded them after their strategists reviewed all available intelligence. The numbers were clear. Any assault against Olympus would require resources on a scale that would leave the Tau Empire vulnerable to imperial counterattack or orc invasion. So the Tau did what they always did when confronted with something beyond their immediate capability to handle. They filed extensive reports, updated their threat assessments, and carefully withdrew to observe from a distance, while they developed better understanding of this new variable in the galaxy's ever-shifting power dynamics. The Grey Knights were the only imperial force to successfully establish anything resembling direct contact with the Olympian gods. And that achievement came at terrible cost. Brother Captain Arvon Stern led a strike force into the warp's depths, protected by the most powerful wards the Ordo Malleus could devise, with the goal of determining whether the Greek gods could be negotiated with or needed to be destroyed. They fought through demon hordes for 3 days of real space-time, though the temporal distortion of the warp made it impossible to determine how long the conflict actually lasted from their perspective. When they finally reached Olympus's base, they found themselves facing not demons, but the automated constructs that Hephaestus had forged. Bronze warriors that moved with mechanical precision and struck with force that could shatter Terminator plate. The Grey Knights destroyed hundreds of these constructs, but for everyone they felled, 2 more emerged from the mountain's depths. It was Athena who ended the conflict, appearing before them with such sudden completeness that even their psychically attuned senses failed to detect her approach. She spoke in perfect High Gothic, though her words carried harmonics that suggested she was actually speaking classical Greek. And their minds were translating the meaning rather than the language. She told them that Olympus had no quarrel with the emperor's servants, that the Greek gods had awakened to reclaim what had been stolen from humanity by chaos, and that the Grey Knights were welcome to return to real space with this message. Brother Captain Stern asked the question that burned in every knight's mind. Did the Olympian gods acknowledge the emperor's divinity? Athena's response was a smile that contained more calculation than any expression should be able to hold. She said that Zeus acknowledged the emperor as humanity's current protector, and that this acknowledgement was the only answer she would provide. The Grey Knights withdrew, their mission technically successful, but their understanding of the situation more complicated than before. The strategic implications of Olympus's presence became clearer as months turned to years, and the mountain showed no signs of fading back into mythology. The warp had changed around it, literally rewriting itself to accommodate this new presence. And those changes were affecting real space in ways that the Imperium's best minds struggled to predict. Warp routes that had been stable for millennia suddenly shifted, forcing navigators to chart new paths through the Immaterium. Some of these new routes were actually faster and safer than the old ones, creating more efficient connections between previously isolated sectors. Other routes became impassable, trapped in psychic eddies generated by the conflict between Olympus and the Chaos Gods. The net effect was a gradual reshuffling of the galaxy's strategic geography, with some worlds finding themselves more connected to the greater Imperium, while others slipped into isolation. The Administratum's bureaucrats worked frantically to update tithe records and military deployment schedules, but they were always reacting to changes rather than anticipating them. The Greek gods were remaking the warp according to principles that predated the Imperium, and there was nothing anyone could do except adapt. Philosophers and theologians across the Imperium found themselves grappling with questions that their doctrine provided no clear answers for. If the Greek gods were real, what did that say about the other religions humanity had embraced and abandoned throughout its history? Could the Norse pantheon awaken? Or the Egyptian gods? Or any of the thousands of divine systems that had guided human civilization before the Emperor's emergence? Some argued that the Greek gods were simply demons wearing familiar faces, sophisticated chaos entities that had adopted mythology as camouflage for their true nature. Others pointed out that this explanation failed to account for the gods' behavior. They fought chaos rather than serving it, imposed order rather than spreading corruption, and demonstrated personalities that remained consistent with their mythological attributes rather than the constantly shifting nature of demonic entities. A third position, popular among certain radical factions in the Inquisition, suggested that the emperor himself had somehow awakened these gods as a strategic counter to chaos, that his will had reached back through human history to resurrect powers that could divide the Ruinous Powers' attention. This theory was attractive because it preserved imperial doctrine. The emperor remained supreme, the Olympian gods merely tools of his grand design. But it lacked any evidence beyond wishful thinking and theological necessity. The truth, insofar as any truth could exist regarding entities operating in the warp where belief shaped reality, was likely more complex than any single explanation could capture. The Greek gods were what they appeared to be: ancient powers tied to humanity's collective unconscious, manifestations of archetypal concepts that had been given form through millennia of worship and sacrifice. They had never truly died, had never actually faded, because nothing that humanity believes in completely ever vanishes from the species' psyche. Those beliefs sink deep, become part of the cultural DNA that gets passed from generation to generation through stories and art, and the subtle assumptions that shape how people understand the world. When the Immaterium spread across the galaxy, carrying with it fragments of old Earth's cultural heritage, it also carried those dormant beliefs. And when the warp's nature shifted in response to the Emperor's 10,000-year vigil, when the Astronomicon created currents in the Immaterium that had never existed before, those ancient beliefs found the psychic resonance necessary to manifest once more. Zeus and his fellow gods had awakened not because anyone had called them, but because the conditions had become right for their return. And now that they walked the Immaterium again, they would not easily be dismissed. The conflict between Olympus and the Chaos gods settled into something that resembled a siege, though applying military terminology to warp phenomena was always problematic. The Ruinous Powers couldn't dislodge the Greek gods through direct assault, but they also couldn't afford to ignore them because Olympus represented a stable point in the Immaterium that threatened to expand. Already regions of the warp near the mountain were becoming more ordered, more predictable, taking on characteristics that made navigation easier and demon manifestation more difficult. If this trend continued, the Chaos gods could find significant portions of their domain transformed into something they couldn't control, and that was intolerable. So they committed resources to containing Olympus, surrounding it with demon legions that maintained constant pressure, probing for weaknesses, preventing the ordered realm from expanding further. This stalemate served the Imperium's interests in ways that made some among the High Lords uncomfortable. Every demon committed to the siege of Olympus was a demon that couldn't be terrorizing imperial worlds, couldn't be leading black crusades out of the Eye of Terror, couldn't be corrupting loyalist space marines or possessing psychers. The Greek gods were fighting the Imperium's enemies with ruthless efficiency, and they were doing it without requiring any imperial resources or support. This should have been cause for celebration, yet it felt wrong to the ecclesiarchy and the more conservative factions. The Immaterium was supposed to stand alone against the darkness, protected only by the Emperor's light and human courage. Accepting help from pagan gods, even inadvertent help that hadn't been requested, seemed like acknowledging that the Emperor's power alone might not be sufficient. Mortals who served the Olympian gods began appearing in real space, and their existence raised even more troubling questions. These weren't possessed individuals or chaos cultists who had switched allegiance to new masters. They were humans, imperial citizens, former guardsmen and hivers, and voidborn, who claimed to have been contacted by the Greek gods and offered service in exchange for power and purpose. They demonstrated abilities that resembled psyker talents, but operated through different mechanisms, calling upon specific gods for specific effects rather than channeling the warp directly. A former guardsman who had sworn himself to Ares could enhance his combat abilities to superhuman levels, fighting with a skill and ferocity that exceeded even space marine capabilities for brief periods before the divine blessing faded and left him exhausted. A woman who had been a navigator before pledging herself to Artemis could track targets across both real space and the warp. Her hunting sense operating through means that had nothing to do with the Astronomicon or traditional warp sight. These god-touched servants didn't register as chaos-tainted when examined by sanctioned psychers or the Sisters of Silence. Yet they clearly wielded powers beyond human baseline. The Inquisition attempted to capture several for study, but the operations proved difficult. The servants of Olympus demonstrated a disturbing tendency to know exactly when they were being hunted, and they defended themselves with divine assistance that made even inquisitorial kill teams hesitate. Those few who were successfully captured provided frustratingly little useful information under interrogation. They described their service to the Greek gods as voluntary, claimed that their powers were gifts rather than corruptions, and expressed no hostility toward the emperor or the Immaterium. They simply believed that humanity needed more than one protector, that the emperor's solitary vigil had left gaps in mankind's defenses that the Olympian gods could fill. Executing them for this belief felt like persecution of the faithful for the crime of faith itself. Yet, allowing them to operate freely set a dangerous precedent. The question of worship became critically important as populations across the Imperium began spontaneously developing cults dedicated to the Greek gods. These weren't the usual chaos cults that the Inquisition suppressed with fire and bolt shell. The worshippers maintained loyalty to the emperor, continued to tithe and serve. But they also offered prayers to Zeus or Athena, or whichever Olympian deity they felt represented their circumstances. Agricultural worlds prayed to Demeter for good harvests, while simultaneously offering devotions to the emperor for protection against Xenos raiders. Forge worlds maintained their standard litanies to the Omnissiah, but added new prayers to Hephaestus for inspiration in their crafts. The ecclesiarchy declared this dual worship heretical and demanded immediate suppression. But the administratum pointed out that the affected populations showed improved productivity and morale, lower crime rates, and actually increased attendance at imperial devotional services. Forcing them to choose between the emperor and the Greek gods seemed likely to create martyrs and genuine heresy, whereas tolerating limited theological flexibility kept worlds stable and productive. The debate raged through the upper levels of imperial governance for years with no clear resolution, because any decision would set precedent for how the Imperium handled future encounters with non-chaos divine entities. And if the Greek gods could awaken, other deities might follow. The Space Marines' response to Olympus varied by chapter, reflecting the diversity of belief and doctrine across the Adeptus Astartes. The Ultramarines, with their emphasis on discipline and classical learning, showed surprising openness to the Greek gods' existence, noting parallels between Roman virtues and Olympian attributes. Other chapters, particularly those descended from more zealous primarchs, declared the entire phenomenon to be chaos corruption in disguise, and lobbied for crusades to be launched into the warp to destroy Olympus. The Grey Knights maintained their position that the Olympian gods were neutral entities at worst, potentially beneficial at best, and that the Imperium had more pressing threats to address. The most interesting response came from several of the Space Wolves' great companies. whose wolf priests noted that their own Fenrisian traditions involved gods remarkably similar to the Greek pantheon, and suggested that perhaps all of humanity's ancient faiths were drawing on genuine powers that predated the emperor's revelation. This theory was declared dangerously heretical by the ecclesiarchy, but it persisted nonetheless, whispered among Astartes who had lived long enough to witness phenomena that imperial doctrine struggled to explain. They had seen too much, fought too many impossible battles, to accept that the universe was as simple as the Ministorum's catechism suggested. The Emperor's tarot began showing new symbols that confused even the most experienced inquisitors who relied upon its guidance. Cards depicting classical imagery, lightning bolts, peacocks, wine cups, hunting bows, appeared in spreads where they hadn't existed before, suggesting that the tarot itself was evolving in response to Olympus's manifestation. Divinations that had once provided relatively clear guidance now produced readings that seemed to acknowledge multiple valid futures, as if the Olympian god's presence had created branching possibilities that didn't exist when the Immaterium faced only chaos and Xenos threats. Some inquisitors argued that this corruption of the Emperor's tarot proved the Greek gods were servants of Tzeentch, weaving deception and false prophecy. Others pointed out that the new cards generally appeared in spreads that warned of chaos threats or suggested paths toward imperial victory, indicating that the Olympian influence might actually be enhancing the tarot's effectiveness rather than undermining it. The debate remained unresolved, but psychers across the Immaterium reported that divination had become simultaneously easier and more complex. The future remained uncertain, but the range of possible outcomes seemed to have expanded, offering more paths to survival than had existed when chaos held complete dominion over the warp's depths. Decades passed, and Mount Olympus remained, a permanent fixture of the warp's geography in defiance of all conventional understanding about how psychic phenomena should behave. The Greek gods had not faded, as the Immaterium scholars predicted they must, had not revealed themselves as chaos entities despite the ecclesiarchy's insistence. They simply endured, prosecuting their war against the Ruinous Powers with the same steady determination that had characterized their mythological attributes. Zeus still hurled lightning that obliterated greater demons. Athena still outwitted demon princes with strategies they couldn't comprehend. Ares still reveled in carnage at the mountain's base, while Apollo's arrows spread terrible clarity through the demonic hordes. The siege continued, a conflict fought on conceptual battlefields where victory meant imposing one vision of reality over another. And slowly, infinitesimally, the Olympian gods were winning. Their realm of order expanded outward from the mountain in increments measured in metaphor rather than meters. But the expansion was real nonetheless. The warp around Olympus was changing, becoming something that resembled the ordered cosmos the ancient Greeks had imagined. Not the chaotic maelstrom of chaos, but a universe governed by laws and principles that conscious minds could understand and navigate. The question that haunted every imperial strategist who studied the Olympus situation was simple and terrible. What happened when the Greek gods won their war? Because they would win eventually, that much was becoming clear to anyone who analyzed the conflict without ideological blinders. The chaos gods were powerful, but they were also divided, constantly undermining each other in their eternal competition for supremacy. The Olympian gods had their conflicts and rivalries, but they understood coordination in ways that Khorne, Tzeentch, Nergal, and Slanesh never had. They could set aside personal grudges to prosecute a strategic objective, could marshal their collective strength against threats that endangered their pantheon. This unity gave them an advantage that would eventually prove decisive. And when Olympus finally broke the siege and began expanding its territory more aggressively through the warp, What would that mean for the Imperium? Would the Greek gods be content to maintain their own domain and leave humanity to worship the emperor in peace? Or would they demand acknowledgement, require that the Imperium recognize their divinity and accept that they had rightful claim to humanity's devotion? The High Lords had no answers, could only watch and wait while the war in heaven, or its closest equivalent, played out in realms beyond human perception. The emperor remained silent, and that silence was perhaps the most significant response of all. If the Olympian gods truly posed a threat to humanity or to the imperial creed, surely the master of mankind would have taken action. The fact that he hadn't, that the Golden Throne's power continued to maintain the Astronomicon without any apparent attempt to combat Olympus, suggested acceptance, or at least tolerance. Some of the more radical inquisitors dared to suggest that perhaps the emperor himself was pleased by this development, that he had always intended for humanity to remember its ancestral gods and integrate them into the broader imperial faith. This theory was dangerously close to heresy, but it persisted nonetheless, whispered in the secret conclaves where those who guarded humanity's survival discussed truths too dangerous for common citizens to know. The emperor had walked among humans during old Earth's classical age. This was confirmed in historical records from before the Unification Wars. What if he had known the gods then, had perhaps worked alongside them or against them, and now saw their return as an opportunity rather than a threat? The galaxy turned, indifferent to theology and metaphysics, and the Imperium endured as it always had. Through brutal pragmatism, through the sacrifice of billions, through the endless war against darkness in all its forms. Mount Olympus had become one more variable in an equation that was already impossibly complex. One more factor that strategists needed to account for when planning campaigns and allocating resources. The Greek gods fought chaos, and that made them useful regardless of what they represented theologically. Their servants provided intelligence on demon movements. Their conflicts drew enemy forces away from imperial territories, and their very existence proved that chaos was not inevitably humanity's destiny. If pagan gods could manifest in the warp and resist corruption, if they could carve out domains that remained stable and ordered despite the Immaterium's chaotic nature, then perhaps humanity itself could learn to do the same. Perhaps the emperor's dream of a secular imperial truth had been premature, abandoned not because it was wrong, but because humanity wasn't yet ready for a universe without gods. And if gods had to exist, better that they be humanity's ancestral deities, powers that had guided civilization through its formative millennia, than the Ruinous Powers who sought only humanity's annihilation or enslavement. In the end, Mount Olympus's awakening in the warp represented something the Imperium had never seriously considered. The possibility that humanity's past might be as important as its future, that what had been could be again, and that the gods who had watched over mankind's childhood might return to protect it during its most desperate hour. Whether this was blessing or curse remained to be seen. But in a galaxy where humanity fought alone against enemies who vastly outnumbered them, where every day brought fresh reports of worlds lost to chaos or Xenos invasion, where the Emperor's light grew dimmer with each passing century despite all efforts to maintain the Golden Throne, perhaps humanity needed whatever allies it could find. Even if those allies were gods from myths that most citizens believed were nothing more than stories. Even if accepting their help meant questioning 10,000 years of imperial doctrine. Even if it meant acknowledging that the Emperor might not be the only divine power that had humanity's survival at heart. The Greek gods had awakened. Mount Olympus stood eternal in the warp, and nothing the Imperium did or didn't do would change that reality. All that remained was deciding how to respond, with the closed fist of dogma or the open hand of desperate pragmatism. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there was only war, that choice might determine whether humanity survived to see the 42nd millennium or finally succumbed to the darkness that had been devouring it piece by piece since the Horus heresy tore the Imperium apart 10,000 years ago.